So we're talking about salvation by grace alone. And this particular sola of the Reformation is perhaps the one that is kind of, I don't know, least unique to the Reformation, I guess. Because if you think of sola fide, sola scriptura, those two things are, very particularly related to those late medieval debates, as we've been talking about, the context of those. The question of sola gratia, though, really goes back in church history a lot farther than those two. And by that, I don't mean nobody believed in those 2 points before the Reformation that I just mentioned, but more that this was a specific controversy that the church dealt with far before the 16th century. So when you hear about these debates about sola gratia, is salvation by grace alone, or is it by grace plus human effort in some sense? Generally, these talks discuss two particular controversies. One of those is Luther versus Erasmus. Right, we have Erasmus's book, The Freedom of the Will. Luther responds with On the Bondage of the Will, which is, if you've ever read both of the books, Erasmus wrote like this tiny little treatise, and kind of in really like a little pretty like mild tone. And Luther, man, he just full blast. Spends like he writes The Bondage of the Will in like a week or something. It's some very short period of time, and he writes this massive response to Erasmus, which shows how much Luther cared about this. And Luther actually ends up saying to Erasmus in this debate, he says, "You alone have pinpointed the place of debate." He tells Erasmus that he's the only one who really understood what these debates were about. So that tells you something significant about Luther's understanding of grace. Because everybody else wanted to go over things like the authority of the Pope or talk about the specifics of purgatory or whatever other theological point. But Erasmus really got to the core of the Reformation, which is the question of whose work is salvation? Is it God's work, or is it a collaborative effort between God and man? And all of the other disagreements really come out of that. But with all that being said, I'm not going to be talking about the Luther-Erasmus debate. So even though that's kind of the place where people tend to go, so I'm going to go a little bit farther back. But the other place that people often go is the debate between Augustine and Pelagius. Again, for good reason, because the debate between Augustine and Pelagius was in many ways similar to the debate between Luther and Erasmus, though it wouldn't be fair to call Erasmus a Pelagian. Pelagius went much farther than someone like Erasmus did. But at the beginning of the 5th century, the end of St. Augustine's life, you had this controversy that developed around this British monk named Pelagius. Now, just quick overview, Augustine, North African church father, most important church father by far. Like, just no one's even close to the influence of Augustine, at least in the West. The Eastern Church doesn't have as significant of an influence from Augustine. But Augustine becomes really the core figure for the Reformation. Everyone claims Augustine. Luther claims Augustine, Calvin claims Augustine, all the Roman Catholic opponents claim Augustine. And everybody debates whose side Augustine is on. Everybody still debates whose side Augustine is on, because we all love Augustine. And really the entirety of Western theology just is from Augustine. It's been said that the entire history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I think in terms of Western theology, we could say the same about Augustine. Right? All theological debates in the West after the 5th century are just footnotes to Augustine. So everybody grabs onto pieces of Augustine. He sets the categories that we all use. He is the one that really sets forth the language, the kind of debate that we're going to have for many years to come that continues today. And Augustine's life can be characterized by 3 major controversies that he faces throughout his life. And the first of those, he was part of a sect called the Manichaeans or the Manichees. And they were a very odd kind of dualistic Christian sect. Basically, they believed that there was kind of a good force in the world and an evil force. And these were kind of 2 equal divine kind of forces opposing one another. This idea was very prominent in the ancient world. It's not so prominent today. For much of history, though, religions had often been divided between like monotheism, polytheism, and this kind of dualism. Like it was very, very common. And you have groups very similar to this that arise throughout the medieval period. It's really mostly died out, though there is actually a group of Manichees that still exists in China. They're very small, but apparently they do. Yeah, I don't know if they're small in that way. Maybe, I don't know, but so they do still exist, but don't have a significant influence. But Augustine writes against the Manichees because he once was a Manichee before his conversion to Christianity. So that's going to be his first controversy, because now he's become a Christian and he's using his intellectual powers to try to refute this heretical group that he had been a part of before that. Then you get this other controversy that erupts in North Africa, and this is over an issue that I had touched on before, which was the question of what do we do with especially pastors who have apostatized, who have fallen away from Christianity, and especially under Roman persecution. And Augustine is dealing with the question of the validity of the sacraments. There are some who basically said, well, if your priest apostatized and he baptized you, you have to get rebaptized by a believing priest now. It kind of devalues the sacraments. Augustine, in response to that, formulates a very strong doctrine of the objectivity of the sacraments, which basically says that the sacraments work because they are God's work. They do not work because of the orientation of the pastor or the his heart posture, his conversion, or anything like that. It's the objective means of grace, the Word of God, and the sacrament that God has instituted. It's objectively valid, not because of the one doing it or the faith of the one doing it. Very significant, and that, of course, is going to be very significant for the later Lutheran tradition as well in our sacramental theology. But then the third of these is the Pelagian debate. This is the last debate that he has at the end of his life. And this Pelagian debate erupts because of a particular phrase that is used in St. Augustine's very famous book, The Confessions. So if you only know one book of Augustine or only read one book of Augustine, it probably is going to be The Confessions. Probably should be The Confessions. It's a wonderful book. And it is essentially his autobiographical telling of his life of conversion, how he came to faith. And within that, he phrases it as a prayer to God throughout the entire book. It's beautiful. And one of those books that I think really sticks with you as you read it, a book that if you do read it, I recommend doing it very slowly and kind of meditatively, really think about what he's saying. But it was very popular at his time. It's often been said that the entire genre of autobiography really starts with Augustine. People weren't really writing autobiographically in this way prior to that. And Augustine doesn't write it to talk about like how cool his life is or something. It's kind of the opposite, to say this is a meditation on sin, this is a meditation on grace, and it's broadly applicable beyond his own life. So in that book, as it's written as a kind of a prayer or series of prayers, he has this particular phrase that he uses where he says, Lord, command what you will and give what you will command. What he means is give the power to do what you command. Well, what he's saying there is, God, I want to obey you, but I can't obey you because I'm a sinner, and if I am going to obey, I need the work of your Holy Spirit. It's only through your Spirit that I can be obedient to your will. Well, there was a British monk named Pelagius who read that. This was a best-selling book of the time. And everybody was reading it, and Pelagius read it, and he did not like that phrase. Because he said, well, that's not fair. God would not command you to do something you cannot do. And so the implication is ought implies can. If God says you ought to do something, then you can do it. It would not be just for God to command you to do something that you could not do. That's Pelagius' argument. This then erupts into a debate. Augustine then writes a series of treatises they're often labeled the anti-Pelagian treatises. If you get like the old chaff set of the volumes of the Church Fathers, it says anti-Pelagian treatises. That doesn't contain all of them, though. His most major anti-Pelagian treatise against Julian is not actually in that set. Probably because it's so big, it would have been an extra volume to include it. And that is actually where that book on the Spirit in the Letter that I mentioned before is. It's in this time period. So, as Augustine is listening to this critique, he starts to develop very clearly what we know as the doctrine of original sin. It doesn't mean that nobody taught original sin in any sense before, but this is the first time that the church really started to develop that in depth. To say, what exactly is the effect of sin on human nature? What exactly does this do to the will, the fallenness of man? What exactly is the connection between Adam's sin and my sin? And Augustine is the first to work this out in a clear, systematic way. So out of that, you have a couple different positions showing up in the church. You have Augustine's position, where Augustine says that we are all born in sin, we are all born in original sin. In some way, when Adam sinned, we are mystically, mysteriously, somehow in Adam, connected with Adam, so that we have the effects of the fall. We are born in sin, and we are therefore born guilty. He then makes this differentiation between original sin and actual sins. So original sin is the condition we're born in. The actual sins are the actual violations of God's law that we commit throughout our lives. So specific sins, whereas original sin is more the condition itself. Pelagius argues against that, where Pelagius says that essentially Adam's sin served, it's not that Adam's sin didn't do anything, but it served more so as a bad example. And Adam kind of turned the human race the wrong way. He had a bad example in his sin, disobedience to God. We sin, and we do that in following Adam's example as well as the other bad examples around us. So it's not, Pelagius wouldn't say that human nature was totally morally righteous as such. Some of the other Pelagians would say that, and Pelagius is maybe a little more careful than that. Pelagius does talk about the necessity of grace, but the way that he tends to define grace is that grace is really the law of God. Like essentially what he's going to say is, by grace, God has given us his moral law and guidance so that we can use our wills to fulfill God's law and thus be saved. So essentially, salvation really comes down to the human will. For Pelagius, God's grace is necessary in some sense, but he's really defining grace more as God's natural gifts than as we would think of as grace. Pelagius will certainly say God forgives sins. He will say that the majority of people do sin in their lives and need to be forgiven, but he holds out the possibility of some never sinning at all. When Job is called blameless, at least many, I think Pelagius does, I'm thinking of Julian in particular, but at least some of the Pelagians are going to use that particular phrase to say, well, Job is blameless, therefore sinless. And Job could choose not to sin. And we can be like Job and be sinless. So Augustine argued very strongly against this. He understood the nature of sin. Along with that, we get the question of the nature of grace. And Augustine said, grace is not just an aid to help us, but grace is that which converts and saves us on its own. In other words, it's not the human will that makes a decision for salvation. It is instead God's grace that radically changes the human will. So Augustine is going to use phrases like, he will say, it is God who saves us, but not without us. And what he means by that is that God doesn't save us without our wills, but he actually changes our wills to will the good. So in other words, right, when you believe in Christ, you can say that the Holy Spirit has given you the gift of faith. Why do you believe? Because God has done it, right? God has changed your will so that you believe. But the faith is still your faith, right? God is giving you faith, but not without you. Like, you actually do believe, but you believe because of the Spirit's work. And that's important, because I think Augustine is sometimes mischaracterized, and Augustinians are mischaracterized as if the human will has no role to play at all. It's just that the human will on its own isn't doing the work. God is converting the will. So for Augustine, essentially, it is grace alone that saves. Why are you a Christian and this other person not a Christian? Because of God's grace. And now, why is the other not is a question that gets into the double predestination question, which is going to be a part of this whole debate, actually, significant part of this. But why did you convert? Is it because you chose to convert, or is it because of God's grace? And Augustine is going to say it's God's grace. Further, Augustine is going to say it's not just the beginning of your life of faith that is an act of grace, He's going to later write this treatise on perseverance, which is one of the last treatises he writes. And there he's going to say God also gives the gift of perseverance. So if you persevere in the faith, that is because God is preserving you in the faith. So in other words, Augustine wants to say that salvation is from beginning to end an act of grace. Now, within that act of grace, there is a changing of the will, but it's not this kind of human, autonomous, I am choosing to do this or that of my own freedom. So, within that, then, we have Augustine formulating even a kind of double predestination. Now, there's some debate from Augustine scholars on exactly the particulars of double predestination, because Augustine did not work this out at all. He really didn't. In a couple of his last treatises, he makes mention of this. There was a double predestination of some kind, but he never really gets into detail about what that means. And he is going to say that those who are saved have been elected in eternity past unto salvation. God did not choose those who are saved because he foresaw something good in them. God's choosing of them results in them doing good. This is very different from the idea of predestination that you find in certain earlier fathers, such as Origen of Alexandria. If you read Origen's commentary in the Book of Romans, especially as he gets into chapter 8 and 9, he starts doing some weird stuff, which Origen always does in his commentaries. He's a very interesting thinker, but very odd. But Origen is very clear, basically, that when God chooses you unto salvation, he does it before creation, but God essentially chooses you in view of the good that he sees that you're going to do. Augustine totally turns that on his head and says it's totally the opposite of the case. You do good because God chose you unto salvation. So he is going to say essentially that your salvation is not conditioned by your own human works. It is God's grace alone that chooses you from eternity past. So he's going to speak of Christians as the elect. And it is God's grace that brings you to Christ. It is God's grace that preserves you unto the end and brings you into eternal glory. He even, when he talks about rewards for good works in heaven, he has this phrase where he says, when God crowns your merits, and he's talking about, yeah, I said merits, I know. When merit is being talked about in a medieval context, I think it's very different from what someone like Augustine is talking about, right? So when Augustine's talking about merit, we don't have this full system of purgatory and temporal punishments, for instance. All of this is not developed at all. Scripture is very clear that there are rewards for our good works in heaven. So we certainly wouldn't say that they contribute anything to your justification, your righteousness before God, but God does reward good works in some way. This is Jesus' motivation to us to do good works in the Sermon on the Mount, right? God is going to reward you in heaven, so don't worry about rewards on earth. There is a reward. So Augustine, speaking about this, does use the language of merits, but he says when God rewards your merit, he is crowning his own gifts. And I think that's a really great phrase. So to say that when God rewards your good works in heaven, he's giving you blessings based on the gifts that he gave you because he's the one who worked those things out in the first place, right? As Paul says in Ephesians, right? It's God who works in you. Those works that God has prepared beforehand. So I think in someone like Augustine, we get really the beginnings of this clear proclamation of what we are calling Sola Gratia. And this is what Sola Gratia is referring to when we're talking about the theology of the Reformation. That the Reformers, and this is true both of the Lutherans and the Calvinists, grab onto this Augustinian principle of Sola Gratia. And they're saying, we're not saying anything new on any of these points. We're just following Augustine. And after all, isn't Augustine like the guy that we're all supposed to follow anyway? According to medieval theology, look at someone like Thomas Aquinas, most important medieval thinker. He quotes Augustine far more than he quotes anybody else. Pelagianism is condemned officially in a North African council in 418. And then he is condemned at an ecumenical council at Ephesus in 431. And he is excommunicated by the Bishop of Rome in 418, Zosimus. So Pelagius' ideas were condemned universally. Actually, it's been said, and I haven't actually checked this or counted, but it's been said, at least, that Pelagianism has been condemned at more councils than any other heresy. Like, this was just so clearly wrong. Even Jerome knew it was wrong. He did, actually. He has anti-Pelagian treatises. They're not as good as Augustine's, but it's okay. So, so we have then this Augustinian theology. And what I'm going to do is move from Augustine into the next generation of thinkers. So we talk a lot about, when we're talking about this debate, the Augustine-Pelagius debate, and as I said, the Luther-Erasmus debate. But to just talk about those two controversies, you're kind of missing a little middle piece there, which is, like 1,000 years of debates on this issue. So this particular issue of the nature of grace and its relationship to sin, and how are you converted? Is it the human will doing something, or is it God's grace alone? This is a controversy that has never stopped in the church. This was not solved after Augustine. It's not like Augustine wrote in the church that we condemn Pelagianism, therefore we all agree. There is a lot of ground in between Pelagius and Augustine. So what we have is an extreme position in Pelagius, which says there is no original sin, and that says that we can obey God's will basically by our own natural powers. You can live a sinless life. No Christian is compelled by that, right? Like that pure Pelagianism does not have a very strong presence in the history of the church. It does actually show up again before Luther's time. I mean, there are some pretty seemingly pure Pelagians, and there's maybe a bit more nuance to it, but essentially they end up in pretty much the same place. So what happens then after Augustine and Pelagius? Well, I'm going to go to a couple other figures that probably are not as well known as Augustine and Pelagius, but they're very significant ones. The first of these is John Cassian, often referred to as Saint John Cassian. His years are 360 to 435. He's raised in Scythia Minor, which is at the Romanian-Bulgarian border. He is a very famous monastic author. He founded the Abbey of St. Victor in 415, which I believe is like the longest existing abbey in the history of the church. This included a group of monasteries for both men and women. So we're talking about very early monastic communities. And because of that, he's a highly significant figure. He is very well known, especially in the Eastern Church, but that doesn't mean he's not well known in the Western Church. He's also a significant figure in the West. In Cassian's writings, you get the wisdom of the Desert Fathers. So if you've heard of the Desert Fathers, you're nodding because you know the Emergent Church, and those guys love the Desert Fathers. If you remember, when I was like in high school, it was like the Desert Fathers were all the rage. I don't know why. I think it's just like this kind of idea of these like very wise men just out by themselves who have this like wisdom to just impart. I don't know. It gives you the impression of like Jedi or something, you know? You got like, it's like Master Yoda on Dagobah. You just got this isolated wise man that you come to get some good advice. The Desert Fathers are kind of weird. Not that there's no wisdom in the Desert Fathers at all, but I'd imagine you'd have to be a bit eccentric to live out in the desert by yourself, especially if you're one of those pillar saints. You know the pillar saints? You guys hear about these? These guys, if you don't know who they are, they like literally just lived on top of pillars, and people would just walk over to the pillars and hear their little seeds of wisdom, I guess. I will say, the Desert Fathers, the pillar saints, there's something to admire about their dedication. Like they were willing to do all this for Christ and for their own spiritual growth. I mean, that's. I can't say that I think it's the most productive way to, grow in your faith. But there is something to be probably admired about their dedication that probably puts us to shame in significant ways. But Cassian is very much in that kind of tradition of spirituality, a spiritual tradition that encourages a lot of strict asceticism, a kind of rigorous bodily training. Cares a lot about making sure that you are in submission to Christ, about spiritual discipline. And with that, he uses that to form these monastic communities that are very influential and very successful monastic communities. But you see, with some of that emphasis, then, you do have a bit of an emphasis on the human will and the role of the human will and the cooperation of the human will. Because if you're in that kind of spirituality, there is going to be that focus on disciplining your will. So, because of that, there is going to be a bit of pushback with this Augustinian Pelagian controversy toward John Cassian. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the specifics here, and I'm going to move on to another figure that's going to be kind of his opponent. But I just want to clarify first. John Cassian is not a Pelagian. Nobody thinks he's a Pelagian. I mean, John Cassian is very clear that we are saved by grace. Without grace, no one is saved. That we're all sinners. Very clear. And so my claim in talking about this is not that John Cassian is a heretic. But what John Cassian does demonstrate here is that the issues between Augustine and Pelagius have not totally been resolved in the theological world. Like your options are not just to be either on Augustine's side or just be a complete denier of original sin. What you get with John Cassian is what later would be, and this wasn't a label at the time, but what would later be called semi-pelagianism, which is the notion of salvation being a kind of synergistic work, where there is a collaboration or cooperation between God's grace and the human will. Now, people like Cassian are all going to say the primacy, of course, is God's grace. But they are going to say that it is necessarily a synergistic work. So conversion is an act of cooperation between the divine and the human will, and perseverance is an act of cooperation between the divine and the human will. To be clear here, within our Lutheran confessions, synergism in relation to sanctification is affirmed. Okay, the confessions, the Formula of Concord, very clearly speaks of cooperation. So this is in Article 2 of the Formula of Concord. So there is a kind of synergism in sanctification in our tradition. What's the difference? Well, we don't generally associate sanctification with salvation. Okay, this isn't not that it's not an aspect of what we call the order of salvation or the fruit of salvation, but the debate about grace alone is really about two particular things: conversion and perseverance. So the question is really, is your conversion the work of God's grace alone, or is your conversion the work of God's grace plus human effort? And the question of, if you persevere to the end and you are finally saved, can you in heaven say, it is God's grace alone that kept me in the faith, or can you say, God's grace plus my human will kept me in the faith so that I'm here in heaven? The question of does the Christian cooperate in good works is not the same question. So if you're saying, is there synergy in good works, as in can you actually choose to do good things, the Christian with the renewed will absolutely can do good things. You're doing it with God's grace, not autonomously, but you can make decisions and choices that are synergistic. So just want to clarify that these are the points in debate. Augustine is clear that there's cooperation in what we would call sanctification. Our Lutheran confessions are clear. Pretty much everybody is. An idea of like what we call a monergistic sanctification is not really a common one historically, though you find it sometimes today. It's not part of our tradition. Okay, then I'm going to move on then to the opponent of John Cassian. His name is Prosper of Aquitaine, Saint Prosper of Aquitaine, one of my favorite church fathers. Not one that's very well known, but I love Prosper. He is, by the way, quoted constantly by Luther and Melanchthon, and in our confessions, except his works were attributed to Ambrose for many years. So you wouldn't know his name because you read it as Ambrose. So if you come across a citation that says Ambrose, the call of all nations, or the call of the Gentiles, that is Prosper of Aquitaine. It's not Ambrose. So unfortunately, though he's hugely influential in the entire development of our theology, we don't know his name because his works were misattributed for many years. But it is St. Prosper. There's not really a debate. We know that it's St. Prosper at this point that wrote these works. Okay. So his year is 390 to 455. So he overlaps with Augustine, but he's a lot younger than Augustine. So at the very end of Augustine's life, Prosper is just beginning to study theology. And so he is a young, zealous theology student, as I'm sure some of you here are. And sometimes a little overzealous in the way that he phrased certain things, as you see in his earlier writing. So he's born and raised in southwestern France. He does receive some kind of formal theological education, but he was actually never ordained. He was not an ordained priest. He was an adamant reader of Augustine. He loved Augustine, and he just read everything of Augustine that he could possibly get his hands on. It's probably some of you just adamant theology readers. You want to just consume as much as you possibly can to get good theological content. That was Prosper. And he also actually really liked the writings of John Cassian. He was very interested in monastic spirituality. Monasticism was growing significantly at this time. Monasticism grew in its impact after the legalization of Christianity. And there are certain sociological reasons for that, probably. Most scholars think that because in the early church, when you were a Christian and you really cared about your faith, you were, well, just a Christian. You just said you were a Christian. In other words, like when you're being persecuted, nobody just says they're a Christian because of the heck of it, right? There's no motive to do that. All of a sudden, Christianity becomes legalized, and you do get a kind of, cultural Christianity in the sense that, not just in the sense that Christianity changes culture, which it does for the good in many great ways, but you get, and that's the good part about it, right? The bad part is you do end up with people in the church who are Christian because the empire is a Christian empire, so they're just who they are. Well, some people who had more serious kind of conversion experiences felt like they had to do something beyond that, and they often would join the monastery. It was kind of what was left for them. So that's one of the reasons. There are other reasons as well. But monasticism is growing as a movement significantly in the 4th century. So Prosper, as he's reading just whatever theological material is popular at the time, he's consuming the writings of Augustine and the monastics. Well, he does, as he's reading Cassian, he's got some concerns about Cassian. He likes things that are in Cassian, but he is concerned about the nature of Cassian's talk about the human will. And essentially he reads Cassian and says, some of this stuff sounds kind of like Pelagius. And he sees this inconsistency with Augustine's theology of grace with Cassian's focus on the human will. So he ends up writing to Augustine in 420, and this is very end of Augustine's life here. And he writes to Augustine, and as a very zealous theology student, and basically says, I found these new Pelagians, and you got to go after them. So Augustine actually responds. His treatise on perseverance is a response to Prosper's letter to him. Augustine never goes after Cassian. He has great respect for Cassian. He doesn't name him at all. He doesn't want to cause a controversy. Prosper's, as I said, maybe a little too zealous at the time. But Augustine does respond, and he does address these issues just before his death. Now, Prosper of Aquitaine after this time, of course, is very encouraged in his own theological career because the most important theologian in the world just wrote a treatise to him. So that's pretty cool. And he then starts doing some of his own writing at that time. Now, Prosper ends up receiving an official position in the church in that he becomes the secretary to Pope Leo. So Prosper is not just a kind of random guy with no education writing books, even though he's not ordained. He has an official position in the church. He has a theological education. And there is some debate about Prosper's relationship to Pope Leo as to kind of who influenced who. It's very clear that Pope Leo influenced Prosper to some extent, but a lot of people try to make the argument that Prosper may have had a very significant impact on Leo's theology as well, which is highly likely, I think. But they had a working relationship. Prosper obviously had a keen theological mind, and he writes first this treatise, De Gratia Dei et Libero Arbitrio, which is on the grace of God and free will. And this early work, along with some other earlier works of Prosper, are put together in a volume called In Defense of Augustine, which is this little early treatises on grace. Now, in those early writings of Prosper, he is a very strict Augustinian, as we would say. In early Prosper, we have clearer statements about double predestination than we have in Augustine. There's even one statement that we find there that teaches a limited atonement. One statement, not a lot, but he does say the death of Christ was for the elect, and seemingly in context, not for others. And Prosper, I think, his theological trajectory is so interesting because it follows the theological trajectory that I see of a lot of theology students, which is this very kind of rigorous desire to defend God's grace and God's power, and kind of ready to fight anybody to defend that. And then throughout his life, his theology is far more moderated, both his tone but also his doctrine. So, and by the way, that doesn't mean that those are not good works. I think there's some really valuable stuff in those works, as much as the double predestination section is not something I prefer. However, I'm not going to get too much into this here. Even then, I think the double predestination that shows up in Prosper is not the same as what happens in later Calvinism. He defines it in such a way that I think it's still a bit different. Well, he then later writes another work that becomes his most influential work, and this is De Vocatione Omnium Gentium, the calling of the Gentiles, or the call of all nations, as it's sometimes translated. This is the one that is cited most often by Luther and Melanchthon, and it's cited in the Lutheran Confessions. And Francis Pieper says it's the only time the church got election right besides the Formula of Concord and the formation of the Missouri Synod. Sounds like Pieper. If you've read Pieper, you would know. Okay. But it's a very important work and a wonderful treatise. So this particular work ends up taking a stance that comes to define what can be called a moderate Augustinianism, which is, he's dealing with this question essentially, well, because it's called the call of all nations. The question is, if God has called all people to himself and God desires the salvation of all, why is it that only some are saved? Now, in Prosper's earlier career, it seems like his answer would have been, because God wants these people to be saved and has decided not to save those people. And at this point, that's clearly not where he's coming from. But with that being said, he holds very, very firmly onto this principle of sola gratia, this principle of grace alone. And he's very clear that everyone who is converted to the faith, all those who come to faith, are all saved by grace and cannot take any credit for themselves at all. So he's always Augustinian on this point. But then when he gets to the question of why then are some others not saved, he's very clear about the universality of grace. And he attributes the non-salvation of those individuals to human resistance, rather than any kind of lack of grace on God's part to those people. And, I've read some commentators talking about this treatise, and they just say, well, he just comes up with a completely contradictory, untenable position. And I say, well, that's what people say about the Lutherans too, so I guess I'm okay with that. But ultimately, it's the biblical position, right? What Prosper is trying to do is this, which is I think what we should all try to do. Take Scripture at face value, contextually, but at face value, without using one set of texts to negate another set of texts. And this is the problem, I think, in some of these debates with Calvinists versus Arminians, which is here you would see the strict Augustinians versus the Cassian type figures. If you want to call them semi-Pelagians or whatever you want to call them. That you've got one set of texts that seems to very clearly teach that God's election is unconditional, that our salvation is solely to be attributed to divine grace. And then you have this other set of texts that is very clear about the universality of God's grace. What the Calvinists tend to do is use those set of the Sola Gratia kind of texts to basically kind of hold over the universal text to say, well, the universal text must not mean what it seems, so they have other ways to interpret those texts. And the Arminians, I think, do the opposite. Of course, the best thing to do is take both sets of texts and say these are both true. If I don't quite know exactly how they fit together, that's also very okay. And that's what Prosper does. He leaves it in the realm of divine mystery. Mystery or paradox is not contradiction, to be clear. This is not a contradiction. It is simply to say that there are things that are above us that I do not have all access to or all of the answers to. And that is okay. Okay, so this move in Prosper then leads him really to be the leader of moderate Augustinianism. And Prosper, after Augustine's death, is considered to be the most vocal and clear proponent of Augustine's theology. Prosper's other really well-known work is he has a work on the Psalms, which is basically a kind of condensed version of Augustine's Psalms commentary in a little more of a digestible, shorter way. And he has some of his own thoughts there too. It's not exactly just a reiteration of Augustine, but he really takes the mantle to say he is going to bring Augustine's teachings to the world. He's going to, and not that Augustine needed it, he was already very well known, but he's going to be continuing that tradition, right, of Augustine's ideas into the future. Okay, so what is the nature of the debate between someone like Cassian and then Prosper? Well, the first is we have to ask the question of like the role of the will, okay? So the will, the human will, everybody agrees that it's fallen. We're not talking about Pelagians here. So everybody's agreed that it's fallen, but the question is, how fallen is the will? For Prosper, the will is totally bound in sin. Now, he uses an image here that you may have heard, and it's cited all the time, but it's always attributed to Luther. And Luther didn't come up with this. Prosper did. So, trying to get Prosper known. I find all these great ideas in him, and I'm like, everybody cites this stuff, but nobody thinks he wrote it, because nobody knows who he is. But if you ever hear this image of the human will as being like a horse, and in sin, the devil is the rider of the horse. Have you heard this before? Okay. Luther uses it in the bondage of the will. That's where this comes from. And so in sin, it's like the devil is the rider of the horse. Now, what's important about that imagery is that the horse is actually moving, right? So the person actually has a will that is choosing to sin, but that will is driven by the rider, right? And that's the devil. And for the Christian, of course, that changes. That the devil is no longer the rider, and that God is the rider and moves us where he wants us to go. Of course, we do tend to push back significantly against that rider, more than we do against the other rider in the unconverted state. So for Prosper, the will is totally bound in sin. For Cassian, the will is distorted by sin, for sure, but there is this spark of goodness in the human will that still remains, even in the sense of talking about spiritual things. So we can certainly talk about some goodness left in the will of all fallen people, in that you don't have to be converted to, love your children or feed the hungry or do some nice thing for somebody else. This is what Melanchthon refers to as the things below us. But in spiritual things, there is no freedom to do spiritual good. We are spiritually blind, dead. Scripture uses that kind of language. So in spiritual things, we have no goodness left. For Cassian, there is a spark of spiritual goodness left even in the fallen will. So for Cassian, grace is necessary for conversion, but the human will must choose to cooperate with God in conversion. At least in how Prosper reads Cassian, the way that Prosper, and I say that because it's been challenged, at least some have challenged this reading of Cassian, but at least how Prosper reads him, Cassian believed that the human will kind of takes a first step toward God, and then grace takes over at that point and completes the process of conversion. So, in short, the debate is this: is salvation by grace alone, sola gratia, or is it a synergistic work of both divine grace and human cooperation? Now, after Cassian's life, and after Prosper's life, this debate doesn't end. You got these two figures. Well, then you start to have some other figures show up that debate these issues further. Fulgentius, if you've ever heard that name, it's an interesting name, who was considered the second Augustine during his lifetime, also North African. Years are 460 to 533. He spent a lot of his career fighting against the Arians. As I said, the Arians were still around at this time. So he's got some really great Trinitarian treatises. But Fulgentius also he's a very committed Augustinian, and he has some treatises on predestination. At times, he certainly doesn't go in the direction of a limited atonement, but there are a couple statements of his that do seem to approach a double predestination perspective. Martin Chemnitz tries to make the argument that what Fulgentius says is actually not Calvinistic double predestination, and I think he makes a decent case. But there is an argument to be had, at least, that he may have been leaned more in what we would call the Calvinistic camp. So by the time of Fulgentius now, you basically have 4 different groups in the church dealing with the Sola Gratia issue. You have the Pelagians are heretics, and everybody thinks they're heretics, so they're not really a group that's around much anymore at this point, at least not with any influence. You have the semi-Pelagians, who are following people like Cassian, and the position of someone like Cassian really becomes the standard in the Eastern Church. Cassian is a highly influential figure in the Eastern Church, though I will say that the Eastern Church tends to be very adamant that they're not semi-Pelagians. The difference between maybe a Cassian and the Eastern Church would be that, at least in Prosper's reading, where the human will takes the first step, the Eastern Church generally will say that divine grace is needed to initiate any process of cooperation. But they certainly tend more in that direction. The second group are those who said, this debate is dumb and who cares? Okay. Well, you get that today too, right? People say, like, this is just a bunch of silly theological, there really were people who said this. These are silly theological debates. Is the difference really that, does it matter that much? Because we all agree we're saved by grace. So like, however this works is, maybe you're thinking too much about this. And then you have the semi-Augustinians or the moderate Augustinians. So Prosper of Aquitaine would be the major thinker that would be identified with this group and its foundation. But the major figure at this time is Caesarius of Arles. Caesarius of Arles is going to preside over the synod that discusses all of this. And then you have the strict Augustinians, and that's Fulgentius. Okay, Fulgentius will be more in that, probably what we would identify more with a Calvinistic approach. And so these views are in many ways very similar to theological divisions we still have today. Well, these debates go on for some time until there is a council called to deal with them, as happens when there are major theological debates. And this is the Second Council of Orange, which meets in 529. Now, Orange is not an ecumenical council, wasn't the entire church. This is in southeastern France. It is largely seen as definitive at the time for the Western Church, though. I mean, even though it didn't have, a total ecumenical acceptance, it was viewed by many as deciding the issue. It is attended by 14 bishops. Caesarius of Arles is the one who presides over this council. 470 to 542 are his years. Now, the decisions of the Synod of Orange are essentially the moderate Augustinian position. So if you read the decrees of the Council of Orange, it's Prosper's approach, which would eventually become the approach of the Formula of Concord, which outlines these issues. So this moderate Augustinian position, as we're talking about, which is the foundation for a Sola Gratia understanding and a Lutheran approach, is not something novel with the Reformation. This was something that was already decided at a council in 529 AD. So this has a very rich history. Pope Felix IV, whose years are 490 to 530, has a letter where he confesses that these decisions, what was decided at the Council of Orange, were the theology of the church. It's pretty interesting. You have a pope that basically says, well, this is what the church believes. And he's asked this question, actually, like, what is the stance on this issue? He's like, this is the church's stance. So you at least have one pope who affirms, even though he doesn't use the phrase sola gratia, what we're talking about when we use the phrase sola gratia. Well, the Synod of Orange is very widely known at the time. The early medieval period sees a lot of citation of these figures, a lot of Prosper, Fulgentius, Caesarius, until all of a sudden it just disappears. 10th century, it's like the synod never happened. So what seems to have happened is that the decrees were just lost. The copies that were used of the decrees of the synod were somehow just gone. So by the time you get to the Reformation, nobody knows the Synod of Orange. And they're discovered around the time of the Reformation. Partially, the Renaissance, the kind of recapturing of older texts, so they're rediscovered. You have another debate in the 8th century that then blows up about this predestination question, where you've got the Venerable Bede, Lupus de Ferrière, and Ratramnus of Corbie all writing treatises defending this what I'm calling the modern Augustinian approach, very clearly monergistic or sola gratia proponents in the church at this time. And this is in the midst of a controversy over an individual named Gottschalk of Orbais. And Gottschalk is a very strict double predestinarian, very clear limited atonement adherent. He's actually imprisoned for his views. And his works are destroyed and he rewrites them in prison. And you can still get them today. They were translated about 10 years ago by a Reformed scholar named Francis Gumerlock. And Gottschalk is a very interesting figure. In many ways, I think he's really the first Calvinist the church ever had in the full sense, This leads to a debate under Emperor Charles the Bald, I always like his name, who asked basically a bunch of theologians to give your opinion on this stuff. And so while I think there were many who expected theologians to respond by basically saying everything that Gottschalk says is wrong, the most sophisticated theologians come out basically in favor of a moderate Augustinianism, not the full-blown Gottschalk kind of Calvinism type of thing. By the time the later Middle Ages happened, though, by 1000 AD, all of a sudden, the synod disappears. You don't see a lot of reference even to those thinkers in the later debates. So what happens is with the rise of scholasticism, you almost have a kind of blank slate on the question of predestination. It's as if the church hadn't debated it before, which is odd. Now, you do get Augustine has always been circulated. So Augustine's always around. Everybody's talking about Augustine. But a lot of these other figures, for whatever reason, are lost in many of these debates. Now, within the medieval church, later medieval church, you have plenty that do hold to a more Augustine position. St. Thomas Aquinas, through his reading of Augustine, it seems that there is a significant change in his thought from his earlier view, which would have been probably closer to a semi-Pelagian view than toward what would be a more Augustinian view. Once you get to that late medieval period, though, with the rise of nominalism, with William of Ockham, you have a rise of what I would call a neo-Pelagianism. And people at the time, I mentioned this before, Gregory of Rimini refers to this as a neo-Pelagianism. But when this new Pelagianism comes, people are basically, and I'm trying to think of how much to explain here because I'm just about out of time, so I can't explain too much. But the argument essentially is that there is a kind of divine grace that is associated with nature itself, as we talked about with Pelagius. So there is a sense in which, because God graciously created our natures, the human will, as it is created by God, can choose to love God above all things. And God will basically credit that as righteousness, as if you do love God above all things. But in a nominalist kind of framework, and if you don't know nominalism, that's okay, but if you do know nominalism, you probably know somewhat what I'm talking about here. I just don't have time to explain it, unfortunately. But just know that it is a kind of new type of Pelagianism that is becoming popular at the time. Now, Occam doesn't go kind of the full way that some of the Occamists did. But there are responses, like I said, Gregory of Rimini, Thomas Bradwardine are probably the major thinkers that respond to this and basically say, this is just Pelagianism. And what Luther responds to is that kind of Pelagianism. So to now kind of come to my conclusion, I know I started a few minutes late here, so I'm going a few minutes over, but we're almost done. So we come to the conclusion here of this. What happens with the Lutheran Reformation? How is this, relevant? Well, when Luther sees Erasmus, he responds in a way that I think is very similar to probably the young Prosper in his zeal, I guess, to John Cassian. Yeah, and probably the connection between Cassian and Erasmus is, I think, a pretty fair one. But when Lutherans had to deal with this issue and think beyond the question of, sola gratia versus, Pelagianism, the Formula of Concord ultimately did arrive at the same conclusion that the Synod of Orange did, which is the conclusion that salvation is solely by grace. You can't attribute your conversion, your perseverance, anything you do to anything in your own human will. I mean, even as I said, we talk about cooperation and sanctification, but even that cooperation and sanctification is only possible because of the renewed will that God has given you. So it's not like this is some kind of, you can't even take credit for that either, right? Even though you can say, technically, I cooperate with God, God is still like, in the driver's seat. He's the one doing the primary work, and the only work that you do is done because God has renewed your will so that you can cooperate with him. So you can't really take credit even for that either. But on the question of double predestination then, the response is that God's grace is universal. So what we have then is these two truths that we have to hold together. The sola gratia, right, grace alone saves, and then universal grace. Grace alone and universal grace. And those are both thoroughly biblical teachings, and we are called to simply proclaim what the Word of God says, and we hold on to both of those realities, even if they don't always seem totally theologically consistent, because we don't know all of the particulars of how all of this works, and that's okay. But I do want to end then with this, just to say, sola gratia stands behind the sola fide. These are connected. Like when we're talking about all these solas, they all relate to each other. And so sola fide, in some ways, I think, is the just consistent kind of flowering of that Augustinian tradition. It's the ultimate end of that Augustinian tradition, which says our salvation is attributed solely to God's grace. And sola fide takes that and says, that's how this sola gratia principle relates to justification. That it's grace alone in the sense that your righteousness is Christ's righteousness, given to you in faith, and that faith is God-given faith that the Holy Spirit has worked within you. All right, well, thank you.